to the Critical Hour. We're coming to you from the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, political analyst, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
For the next 2 hours, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. Two RT employees indicted for covertly funding and directing U.S. company that published thousands of videos in furtherance of Russian interests has now they've been accused, and it's now been announced by Attorney General Merrick Garland, an indictment charging Russian nationals Konstantin Kalishnikov, also known as Kostya, and Elena Afanasyeva, also known as Lena, with conspiracy to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act and conspiracy to commit money laundering was unsealed today in the Southern District of New York, and these two individuals are at large. For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Quote, our approach to combating foreign malign influence is actor-driven, exposing the hidden hand of adversaries pulling strings of influence from behind the curtain, said Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. As alleged in today's indictment, Russian state broadcaster RT and its employees, including the charged defendants, co-opted online commentators by funneling them nearly $10 million in pro-Russia propaganda and disinformation across social media. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Horne, and do you see this as being limited to actions by RT, or are there more nefarious intentions behind this?
Certainly the latter. Obviously, it's difficult to judge what you just described without judging simultaneously what's unfolding in the Tampa, St. Petersburg area of Florida, where Chairman O'Malley and his comrades in the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement are now facing trial in the halls of injustice for reasons eerily similar to these charges just unveiled by Lisa Monaco of the Justice Department. Certainly, we should not forget what has befallen Scott Ritter, the former arms inspector, now viewed widely as a dissident who has been a frequent guest on numerous platforms, including your own, as I understand it, rebuking and reprimanding U.S. foreign policy, particularly as it relates to the escapade in Ukraine, not to mention the funding and financing and arming of the piratical regime in Israel. We are also aware of what has befallen Richard Metters, who is a frequent speaker on issues related to Iran in particular. He was detained in London summarily just a few days ago in a blatant violation of civil rights and civil liberties, causing some commentators to suggest that England, Great Britain, is moving steadily towards a unique kind of fascism. I think that in order to understand what's happening, including raids on pro-Palestinian forces in Canada, in Germany, and elsewhere, we have to understand the hysteria that is gripping U.S. imperialism in light of the ascension of this de facto alliance featuring Russia, China, and Iran, most particularly. Recall that the late National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, in one of his final books, The Grand Chessboard, suggested that U.S. imperialism would justifiably be fearful if there was a de facto alliance developing between Russia, China, and Iran. And that is precisely what's happening as we speak. Certainly, Washington is upset and not pleased by what's going on in China right now, where you have 4 dozen plus African heads of state and government who are meeting in Beijing with sizable entourages in tow, with economic development being high on the agenda. It's no secret, as many historians, including myself, have pointed out, that the way in which the North Atlantic countries were able to soar to global preeminence was precisely by the battering and bludgeoning of the African continent. And when Africa begins to arise, particularly when it begins to rise in league with China, now the number 2 economy on planet Earth, use the expression, with a bullet, then it's understandable why there's hysteria gripping Washington. It's understandable why, if you survey the think tanks in Washington, the Brookings Institute, the Hudson Institute, the Atlantic Council, the other war criminals in training and in actuality, they feature routinely grim scenarios about war against China, about accelerating the arming of Ukraine, and of course, bulwarking NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the process. But at the same time, we should not necessarily be overly focused on the contemporary moment, because we should also recall that there is a history to what we're describing. Recall that it was more than a century ago when the socialist leader Eugene Debs was jailed because of his opposition to U.S. foreign policy. Recall that in the early 1950s, W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, a framer of Pan-Africanism, was handcuffed, charged with being the agent of an unnamed foreign power. Actually, it was, of course, Moscow. He barely was able to escape prison at the age of 83 as a result of a mass campaign. Recall at the same time that his comrade, Paul Robeson, the late great activist, radical linguist, was being persecuted and pulverized by the U.S. authorities since he had the gumption to take the U.S. to the United Nations, charging U.S. imperialism with genocide against Black people. And so, once again, we see the repetition of history, but just as we were able to save Du Bois from the Hooskow, I dare say that this current effort of the Justice Department, or shall I say the Injustice Department, will be met with a similar inglorious fate.
Dr. Horne, I just watched Merrick Garland's press conference, and one of the things I took note of was that he mentioned, the trifecta of evil, I guess they call them. He mentioned China and Iran with no specifics, just that they wanted election interference. And I started looking, and there were these accusations that China was going after both Trump and Biden. And then we're supposed to believe that, Iran has a preference between Trump and Biden. And I started looking in, and I realized they've now gotten to the point where they're making accusations of, quote, election interference, but the election interference is against both candidates. There's a certain level of absurdity to thinking that China and Iran are just going to we'll just go after both candidates. One of them's going to win, but Trump or Harris. One of them's going to win, but we're doing it just to, I don't even know, cause discord, whatever that is. Dr. Horne.
Well, certainly we should not be indifferent to the current reality in the United States of America. As the presidential candidate Cornel West has put it, if you vote for the Republicans, you're voting for the possibility of fascism and civil war. If you vote for the Democrats, according to Cornel West, you're voting for the potential of World War III. Obviously, he has his eyes on what's unfolding in Ukraine, with the U.S. authorities led by President Biden arming the Kiev regime to the teeth as they strike more deeply into Russia. Quite extraordinary, these attacks on a nuclear power. And we cannot talk about this hawkish profile of the Democrats without understanding how it was manufactured. Recall what I said a moment or two ago about what befell Du Bois and Robeson. This was happening at a time when the United States was being embarrassed by its apartheid, its Jim Crow policies, and the way it was able to escape censure to a degree amongst rising nations in Africa and the Caribbean who were objecting to U.S. persecution of people of African descent in this country, was to move haltingly away from the more egregious aspects of U.S. apartheid and Jim Crow, but at the same time tossing overboard the most internationalists amongst our leaders, led by Du Bois and Robeson. And this has led to this very unfortunate circumstance of today, where many of our leading Black figures are missing in action when it comes to reining in the hawkishness of the Democrats, allowing them to a certain degree to become this party of, as Cornell puts it, the party of World War III. And that has been bolstered by another unfortunate reality, which is that you have the so-called never Trump elements. Speaking of Joe Scarborough of MSNBC, a former Republican congressperson, Nicole Wallace of MSNBC, a former press secretary to a Republican president, they're flooding into the Democrats, bringing their backwards ideology with them, and that's tipping the scales even more towards this spectacle that we just witnessed today, where you see the Democratic Justice Department, or Injustice Department, if you like, seeking to enforce a certain kind of groupthink on the U.S. body politic, which is of a piece, once again, with their persecution of Chairman O'Malley, the African People's Socialist Party, and the Uhuru Democratic Movement in the Tampa Bay area as we speak.
I think there's also, you mentioned Scott Ritter, you've just mentioned the Uhuru Three. There are other elements. There's also, I think, another element of context here, which is that Mark Zuckerberg just sent a letter to Jim Jordan apologizing for Meta, as my words, but his point, falling prey to pressure from the Biden administration to tamp down COVID-19 discussion, as well as tamp down discussion about the Hunter Biden laptop. And then there's a piece back from a couple of years ago from NBC. U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. So these are very clear pieces of evidence saying that the Biden administration is involved in the very same tactics that it is accusing others of engaging in. So, Dr. Horne, is this whataboutism, or is this the pot calling the kettle black?
Well, it's probably a bit of both. With regard to the Biden controversy, of course, buried were the revelations found in the laptop of presidential son, Hunter Biden. Mr. Biden Sr. was still running for office. I dare say that this would be a major campaign issue. But also, we should ponder this very carefully, which is that recent scholarly work from rather respected scholars have pointed out that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the leading military body in the United States, routinely have meetings where no minutes are taken. That over the years and over the decades, millions of pages of confidential and otherwise sensitive and secret records have been destroyed by the U.S. authorities, which makes it difficult to trace a paper trail so that we could find out who are the real miscreants. And that bespeaks the shrinking of democratic space in this country, where supposedly the First Amendment and the right of freedom of speech supposedly is held dear. But obviously, that's just one more example of the kind of double talk, double speak, and hypocrisy that has come to characterize official Washington, D.C.
Well, Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.